Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you something right now. Silence is not just the absence of sound, it is the presence of truth. When you and somebody you care about both go silent, you might think nothing is happening. But trust me, something big is happening. Sometimes the loudest shifts in a relationship start in the quietest moments. Silence isn't empty at all. In fact, it is one of the most revealing and powerful states two people can experience. Most folks think silence means nothing is happening, but that's only because they're listening with their ears instead of their intuition. When two people fall quiet with each other, whether it's after a disagreement, a misunderstanding, or simply a moment of emotional overwhelm, there is a deep emotional stirring taking place beneath the surface. Silence becomes the space where truth whispers, where hidden thoughts rise, and where everything unsaid starts gaining weight. In that quiet space, you begin to see things more clearly than you ever could when words were flying back and forth. Silence forces you to confront your real feelings. When there's no noise to distract you, you start to hear your own heart. You begin to recognize the things you dismissed, the emotions you didn't want to acknowledge, and the truths you didn't want to face. Silence shines a light on what you've been avoiding. Maybe you realize you care more than you thought. Maybe you discover you've been giving too much. Maybe you see that the other person doesn't show up for you the way you show up for them. Silence becomes the teacher that never raises its voice, yet somehow delivers the most unforgettable lessons. When two people both go silent, each mind becomes a battlefield of reflection, doubts, memories, regrets, wishes, and hope. You replay conversations, you analyze moments, you try to understand what you missed, what you meant, and what they meant. Silence sharpens memory. It calls back all the little things that didn't matter at the time but matter a whole lot now. You think about the way they looked at you, the tone they used, the things they said quickly, and the things they didn't say at all. Suddenly, every detail feels important, because silence creates space for contemplation. But silence also creates emotional distance. Distance reveals truth. When you both go silent, the real test begins. Who misses who checks in, who stays stubborn, who lets pride sit in the driver's seat. Silence shows who truly values the relationship and who sees it as optional. It exposes intentions without needing to ask. If someone really cares, the silence becomes unbearable for them. They feel the weight of that quiet, and they move toward resolution. If they stay silent comfortably, their silence speaks louder than any apology ever could. It means the connection doesn't anchor them emotionally. That is a truth many people don't want to accept, but silence forces you to. Silence is also full of unspoken emotions: hurt, confusion, longing, frustration, and fear. Sometimes the silence between two people is not about punishment or ego. It's about emotional overwhelm. People go quiet because they don't know what to say, or because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. They go quiet because they need time to think, to calm down, to find their ground again. Silence becomes a way to protect the relationship from words that can't be taken back. It is a pause, not a period, a reset, not a rejection. But that distinction only becomes clear with time, and that time is often uncomfortable. There is also a deeper layer within silence, the unspoken communication. Two people who care about each other can say so much without saying a word. Silence can say, "I'm hurt." Silence can say, "I need you." Silence can say, "I'm trying to figure this out." Silence can say, "I don't know what to do." Silence can say, "I'm waiting for you to show me something." It becomes a language of its own, one that requires emotional intelligence to understand. When you truly know someone, silence becomes readable. You learn what their quiet means, what it hides, what it protects, and what it is trying to reveal. But silence can also be dangerous if pride steps in. Two people can lose each other simply because neither one wanted to be the first to speak. Silence can turn into misunderstanding. Misunderstanding can turn into emotional distance. Emotional distance can turn into resentment. Resentment can turn into a story both people start telling themselves. If they cared, they would have reached out. But the truth is, sometimes both people care deeply. They're just both scared. Scared of rejection, scared of vulnerability, scared of opening the door first. Silence becomes the battleground where love fights ego, and too often ego wins. And yet, silence also has the power to rebuild. Sometimes, when two people step away and go silent, they return stronger because they've had time to breathe, reflect, and understand each other without the noise of emotion clouding their minds. Silence can bring clarity. It can reveal mistakes you didn't realize you made. It can make you miss the other person enough to let go of pride. It can soften anger, dissolve tension, and remind you of the bigger picture. When silence is used wisely, it becomes a bridge, not a barrier. Ultimately, silence is never empty. It is full of choices, full of realizations, full of truth. What matters is not the silence itself, but what both people decide to do within it. Silence holds the power to either strengthen a bond or break it. It exposes what talking sometimes hides. It gives answers without asking questions. And most importantly, it shows the difference between someone who cares deeply and someone who was only passing through. When two people go silent, their actions suddenly become louder than anything they could ever say. You start to realize that silence is not just a pause in the conversation. It is a spotlight. It shines directly on behavior, intentions, and emotional patterns. When words stop flowing, actions step forward, and in those quiet stretches of time, you finally see what was always there but hidden behind talking, excuses, and emotional noise. You notice who shows up without being asked, who checks in without being pushed, who reaches out because they genuinely care. And you also see who disappears the moment communication requires effort. Action is the real language of love and commitment, and silence gives it room to speak clearly. When two people fall quiet, the dynamic of the relationship changes from verbal to behavioral. Arguments fade, explanations stop, and the truth begins to rise through what each person does or doesn't do. Some people think staying silent means power, but the real power is in what your silence reveals about them. Do they step closer and try to mend the bond, or do they step back and wait for you to do all the emotional labor? Do they try to fix the distance, or do they sit comfortably in it? Silence exposes priorities. If someone truly values you, your absence becomes uncomfortable. They feel the imbalance, they feel the gap, they feel the pull to restore connection. But if they can go days or weeks without communicating, that silence doesn't just say something, it screams it. Actions during silence tell you everything you need to know about a person's investment. Someone who cares will show it, even if they're hurt or confused. They'll send a message, reach out gently, try to understand the situation, or at least show they're thinking about you. They won't let pride outweigh affection. They won't let misunderstandings grow unchecked. They won't allow silence to turn into separation. But someone who isn't invested will use silence as an escape. They'll use it as an excuse to avoid responsibility, accountability, or effort. They'll treat silence like freedom instead of discomfort. They won't notice you're quiet because they were never fully tuned into you in the first place. In the quiet moments between two people, you also begin to understand who was giving and who was taking. When communication stops, the one who has been carrying the emotional weight feels it the most. They feel the emptiness because they have always been the one trying, reaching, soothing, and repairing. Silence becomes a painful reminder of how much effort they were putting in and how little was being returned. Meanwhile, the other person, used to receiving without contributing, may feel nothing at all. They may even feel relief because they never understood the emotional value of the connection in the first place. Silence reveals imbalance. It shows who was watering the relationship and who was just enjoying the shade. Actions taken during silence can also show you the emotional maturity of both people. Some people go silent not because they don't care, but because they need space to calm down, think, and avoid saying something they'll regret. This kind of silence is intentional and protective. Their actions during this time reflect that maturity. They might step back, but they will eventually step forward with clarity and respect. Others, however, go silent because they want to punish, control, or manipulate. They weaponize the quiet. They wait to see if you'll chase them, beg them, or panic into apologizing for things you didn't even do. Their silence is not reflection. It is strategy, and their actions during silence reveal the true nature of their character. Silence also highlights which relationships are grounded in ego versus those grounded in love. When ego dominates, both people wait for the other to make the first move. Both want to win, not heal. Both want to protect pride, not the bond. But love behaves differently. Love moves. Love softens. Love makes the first call, sends the first message, offers the first olive branch. Love chooses connection over ego every time. During silence, you can immediately distinguish between ego-driven and love-driven individuals based on whether they choose action or stubborn stillness. Silence becomes the great separator. Those who care break it, those who don't cling to it. And while silence tests the other person, it also tests you, your own actions, how you respond, how long you wait, what thoughts you entertain. Reveal your emotional patterns, insecurities, and strengths. Silence makes you question whether you should reach out or hold back. It makes you examine whether you are acting out of love or fear. It forces you to ask yourself whether you're fighting for someone who is not fighting for you. And in that self-reflection, your own clarity grows. You learn what you need, what you deserve, and what you can no longer tolerate. In some cases, silence becomes a turning point. The person who took you for granted suddenly realizes your absence isn't temporary. They notice the difference between comfort and effort, between assumption and appreciation. Their actions shift. They return with sincerity, accountability, and understanding. They break the silence not because they need attention, but because they recognize your value. They finally understand that silence wasn't a punishment, it was a mirror. In other cases, silence becomes the closure you never received verbally. Someone who was inconsistent stops reaching out, stops showing up, and stops pretending. Their lack of action becomes the answer you couldn't get from their words. Silence completes the story for you. The absence of effort becomes the explanation. And while painful, it is also liberating. Because once silence shows you the truth, you no longer waste energy on illusions. Ultimately, when two people go silent, actions replace words. What they do in the quiet becomes the clearest expression of who they are, how they feel, and what they want. Silence removes the mask. Actions reveal the heart, and in that space, you finally see the truth that talking could never uncover. Silence has a way of exposing the emotional distance that was already forming long before the quiet arrived. When two people go silent at the same time, it isn't just a break in communication. It is a reflection of the space that has slowly been building between them. That distance didn't come out of nowhere. It came from unresolved issues, ignored feelings, unspoken truths, and quiet disappointments that were brushed aside instead of dealt with. Silence simply makes that distance visible, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. When you stop talking, you finally notice the miles you've drifted apart, even while standing side by side. Emotional distance doesn't always start with loud arguments or dramatic conflicts. Sometimes it begins with small disconnects, those little moments when one person didn't feel heard, when affection was taken for granted, when appreciation wasn't expressed, or when effort became one-sided. These tiny fractures accumulate over time. They weaken the bond little by little until the emotional foundation begins to shake. Silence becomes the moment when the cracks reveal themselves. And instead of pretending everything is fine, silence forces both people to face the truth of how far they've grown from each other. When silence sets in, the distance becomes something you can actually feel. You feel it in the lack of messages. You feel it in the absence of warmth. You feel it in the way your mind begins to wander into spaces filled with doubt and insecurity. You feel it when you reach for your phone and stop yourself, wondering whether they even care. You feel it when you realize how quickly they adapted to the quiet, how easily they accepted the disconnect. Emotional distance becomes almost tangible, like a wall standing between two hearts that once felt connected. Silence is the atmosphere where emotional distance expands. Without conversation to bridge the gap, the mind begins to fill the quiet with assumptions. If someone doesn't respond, your thoughts start forming stories. You question their intentions. You question your importance. You question whether the connection was ever as deep as you believed. Silence creates mental distance just as much as emotional distance. And because the mind naturally exaggerates what it doesn't understand, that distance can start to feel larger than it actually is. The danger is that silence can turn temporary emotional distance into something permanent. When people don't talk, misunderstandings grow unchecked. Misinterpretations expand. Resentments deepen, and all of it happens silently, without either person realizing how far the other has drifted until the gap becomes too wide to cross. Emotional distance is like a quiet ocean. What starts as a ripple can turn into a wave that pulls two people in opposite directions without either of them noticing until they look up and can no longer see the other shore. Silence also magnifies the distance because it removes the chance for reassurance. One of the most powerful things in a connection is knowing that even when things aren't perfect, you are still valued, understood, and chosen. But silence cuts off that reassurance. It leaves you with questions instead of answers. It makes you wonder whether the bond still exists. It makes you wonder whether they're thinking of you, missing you, or slowly moving on. The emotional distance becomes a space filled with unanswered questions and unspoken fears. Sometimes the emotional distance revealed by silence is a sign of deeper incompatibility. People who struggle to communicate their feelings often retreat into silence when things get difficult. They shut down instead of opening up. They avoid instead of addressing. They walk away emotionally long before they physically step back. Silence uncovers these patterns. It shows you whether someone is emotionally available or emotionally absent. It reveals whether they're capable of healthy communication or whether distance is their default response to conflict. Silence brings clarity to what talking often hides, but silence doesn't always mean the end. Sometimes emotional distance appears because both people feel overwhelmed, hurt, or uncertain. They step back not to disconnect but to gather themselves. They retreat into silence because they don't want to make the situation worse. This kind of distance is temporary. It's a moment of emotional protection, not emotional abandonment. The difference between temporary and permanent distance becomes clear by how both people behave when the silence starts weighing on them. Do they make a move to reconnect? Do they miss the bond? Do they soften internally? Those answers reveal everything. Emotional distance also forces you to look at your own heart. Silence gives you the space to examine what you've been accepting, what you've been tolerating, and what you've been hoping for. Sometimes you realize the distance didn't just come from them. You contributed too. perhaps by holding back your feelings, avoiding difficult conversations, or expecting them to read your mind. Silence makes you evaluate your own role in the disconnect. It opens your eyes to your patterns, your fears, your needs, and your unmet expectations. Emotional distance becomes a mirror reflecting both sides, but silence can also highlight a painful truth. Sometimes the distance didn't suddenly appear. The connection simply wasn't as strong as you thought. Maybe you cared more deeply. Maybe you were more invested. Maybe you felt the bond more intensely. Silence exposes that imbalance. It shows who feels the distance as loss and who barely notices it. And that realization can be heartbreaking but necessary. Because emotional distance, once revealed, cannot be unseen. In the end, silence is not the creator of distance. It is the revealer of it. The space that appears between two people when communication stops is simply the emotional space that was already forming underneath. Silence brings that hidden distance to the surface. It shows where the relationship truly stands, what needs healing, what needs honesty, and what might be beyond repair. Silence turns invisible emotional gaps into undeniable realities. And from that moment forward, both people must choose whether they will continue drifting apart or make their way back toward each other. Silence is one of the greatest tests of emotional intelligence because it strips away all the noise, all the defensiveness, all the distractions, and forces you to sit face with your own maturity. When two people go silent, the real question becomes, how do you handle that silence? Do you panic? Do you lash out? Do you assume the worst? Or do you breathe, think, and respond with clarity instead of impulse? Emotional intelligence is not measured in how you communicate when everything is smooth. It's revealed in how you carry yourself when everything goes quiet. Silence exposes who can manage their emotions and who allows their emotions to manage them. When silence enters a relationship, emotionally intelligent people don't jump to conclusions. They don't let fear write the story. They don't let insecurity paint false narratives. Instead, they pause. They look inward first. They try to understand the situation instead of reacting to it. Emotional intelligence gives you the ability to sit in silence without letting it drive you into chaos. It teaches you to stay calm in the uncertainty and not let assumptions reshape your reality. Two people can go silent, but it's emotional intelligence that determines whether that silence becomes communication or conflict. Emotional intelligence also determines whether silence becomes a tool for growth or a weapon for punishment. Some people use silence to hurt, manipulate, or gain emotional control. They know the power of withholding attention, affection, or words. They use the silence to create anxiety or insecurity in the other person. This kind of silence isn't emotional intelligence. It's emotional immaturity. Emotionally intelligent people don't use silence to punish. They use it to prevent saying something that would cause harm. They use it to process their feelings. They use it to cool down instead of exploding. Their silence comes from care, not cruelty. When two people go silent, the emotionally intelligent one doesn't immediately assume the relationship is falling apart. They understand that silence can mean many things: reflection, overwhelm, confusion, hurt, or simply a need for space to breathe. Instead of reacting impulsively, they try to understand what the silence represents. They ask themselves questions with honesty. What triggered this quiet? Did something go wrong? Are they overwhelmed? Did I say something hurtful? Or is this silence about them and not about me? Emotional intelligence helps separate facts from assumptions and truth from fear. Silence also tests communication skills. Emotional intelligence teaches you to listen, even when there are no words being spoken. It teaches you to read emotional energy, observe behavior, and understand patterns. During silence, someone with emotional intelligence pays attention to what has been happening in the relationship. They remember past conversations, past disagreements, past emotional cues. They don't build stories out of thin air. They build understanding from context. They recognize when the silence is simply a pause and when it is a sign of deeper hurt. They know when to wait and when to gently reach out. They understand timing, tone, and intention in a way that helps reduce conflict rather than intensify it. One of the most important aspects of emotional intelligence is the ability to regulate your own emotions during silence. Many people allow silence to trigger impulsive behavior, angry messages, guilt trips, accusations, or overthinking. But emotional intelligence teaches you to step back. It teaches you to breathe. It teaches you to wait until the emotional storm passes before taking action, because decisions made in emotional chaos often create more chaos. Emotionally intelligent people don't feed their fears, they soothe them. They don't act from insecurity, they act from clarity. Silence gives them the space to practice that maturity. Silence also tests empathy. Emotionally intelligent individuals don't just think about how the silence affects them, they think about how the other person might be feeling too. They consider the possibility that the other person is hurting, overwhelmed, stressed, or afraid. They don't assume selfish intent. They make room for humanity. Empathy allows them to approach the silence with compassion instead of blame. It allows them to respond gently, not harshly. It allows them to say, "I'm here when you're ready," instead of "Why are you ignoring me?" That emotional softness can transform the silence into a bridge instead of a wall. Emotional intelligence is also shown in how someone chooses to break the silence. Whether they reach out with calmness, patience, and clarity, or with anger, accusation, and resentment, reveals everything. People with emotional intelligence choose timing wisely. They choose their words intentionally. They open the door gently instead of kicking it down. They aim to reconnect, not dominate. They offer understanding before demanding explanation. They prioritize peace over ego. Their goal is healing, not winning. When both people in a relationship have emotional intelligence, silence becomes a moment of reflection rather than destruction. They understand that quiet doesn't mean distance. It can mean processing, healing, or recalibrating. They know that silence doesn't have to be feared. They break it with maturity and care. They return to the table with clearer minds and softer hearts. Silence becomes the pause before progress, not the beginning of the end. But when only one person possesses emotional intelligence, silence becomes a painful mirror. The emotionally mature person tries to handle the quiet with grace, but the other reacts with avoidance, manipulation, indifference, or immaturity. The imbalance becomes clear. Emotional intelligence, or the lack of it, decides the fate of the connection. In the end, silence doesn't just reveal emotional distance or hidden truths. It reveals emotional intelligence. It reveals how you communicate, how you think, how you interpret, and how you care. It reveals whether you operate from fear or understanding, ego or empathy, panic or patience. Silence isn't the problem. It is the stage where emotional intelligence steps forward and shows who is truly equipped to build a healthy relationship and who is still ruled by their unhealed emotions. Silence is one of the most powerful forces when it comes to revealing what someone truly feels or intends. Because when there are no words to hide behind, the truth rises to the surface whether people want it to or not. When two people go silent, that quiet space becomes the moment of truth, the space where real intentions finally show themselves. A person can talk for hours, explain everything, make promises, give excuses, and paint a picture with words. But silence removes the performance. It removes the script. It removes the mask. It reveals what their heart has been quietly doing all along. You find out who reaches out, who pulls back, who grows restless, who becomes distant, and who steps forward without hesitation. Silence exposes the feelings that words could never accurately express. When you go silent with someone, you begin to notice the energy shift. If they care about you deeply, the silence becomes uncomfortable for them. They feel the gap. They feel the missing presence. They feel the emotional absence. They feel the pull to reconnect because their intentions are rooted in love, not convenience. They think about you. They wonder how you're feeling, and they move toward you even if they're unsure of what to say. Their actions reflect their emotional investment. Genuine feelings cannot stay quiet for long. They show themselves even when the person tries to hide them. On the other hand, silence reveals just as much about those who don't care, or who only cared when it was easy. When you both go quiet, someone who wasn't truly invested doesn't feel the distance. They don't feel the void. They don't feel compelled to check on you or repair what's broken. Their silence becomes comfortable because they were emotionally gone long before the words stopped. Silence doesn't create the truth. It simply uncovers it. It shows you whether their feelings were strong, weak, temporary, or non-existent. You learn more about someone in silence than you ever could in long conversations. Silence also reveals emotional priorities. When a person truly values you, they don't let silence linger endlessly. They reach out not because they want attention, but because they don't want to risk losing you. They're not trying to win, they're trying to connect. But when someone's intentions were shallow, silence gives them a way out. They slip away quietly, thinking you won't notice. Their lack of effort becomes the confession they never said. Silence becomes the truth they didn't have the courage to speak. And the moment you see it, you can never unsee it. The quiet also exposes hidden fears and insecurities. Someone who truly cares but struggles with vulnerability may feel torn during silence. They want to reach out, but fear holds them back. They want to speak, but they're scared of rejection. In this case, their silence reveals emotional conflict, not emotional detachment. You learn that they feel deeply, but express slowly. Silence helps you understand which walls are from disinterest and which walls are actually protecting wounded parts of them. It shows you the depth of their inner world, whether they're running from love or simply afraid of losing it. But silence isn't just about uncovering someone else's truth. It uncovers your truth too. When everything goes quiet, you start to see what you really want, what you've been tolerating, and what you've been afraid to admit. Silence makes you confront your own intentions. Maybe you realize you were holding on to someone who was already letting go. Maybe you discover you were giving more than you were receiving. Maybe you recognize that your heart deserves more than someone who disappears during the quiet moment. Silence forces you to evaluate whether the connection was built on genuine love or emotional illusion. You learn whether your attachment was rooted in hope or reality. Silence strips away illusions. It reveals the difference between someone who talks beautifully and someone who shows up consistently. It reveals who stays connected emotionally even when communication stops. It reveals whether the bond was strong or fragile. It reveals whether the connection was mutual or one-sided. You learn whether you were valued or simply convenient. Silence uncovers the truth with a clarity that words often blur. Silence also has the power to reveal timing. Sometimes both people care, but they're emotionally out of sync. One might need space to process, while the other needs reassurance. One might be overwhelmed, while the other is confused. Silence brings awareness to these differences. It shows whether the relationship has room for patience or whether the gap is too wide to bridge. For some people, silence becomes the pause needed to return stronger. For others, silence becomes the moment they realize they want different things. The truth always rises in silence, even when it hurts. When two people go silent, another layer of truth emerges, the truth about effort. You see who tries to fix things. You see who takes responsibility. You see who pretends nothing is wrong. You see who hopes things will resolve without communication. Effort, or the lack of it, becomes the truth. Not the words, not the promises, not the plans. Effort. Real intentions show themselves through action, not conversation. Silence is also powerful because it removes emotional noise. Without talking, you can finally see the pattern of the relationship clearly. You see whether there was consistency or chaos, maturity or immaturity, sincerity or manipulation. Silence gives you the clarity to understand what you were too close to notice. It gives you the vision you needed. It gives you the truth you weren't willing to admit. Silence always tells you the truth if you are brave enough to listen. In the end, silence uncovers everything: the real feelings, the hidden intentions, the emotional patterns, the strengths, the weaknesses, the insecurities, and the desires. It becomes the moment where truth rises to the surface, unfiltered and undeniable. And once silence reveals someone's real intentions, you gain the clarity to decide what to do next, without doubt, without confusion, and without lies. When two people who once talked freely suddenly go silent, a powerful shift begins to unfold, and most folks never realize how deep that silence actually goes. Silence is not empty. Silence is loaded. It carries the weight of every emotion that wasn't spoken, every question that wasn't answered, every hurt that wasn't addressed, and every expectation that slowly faded into the background. When both people go quiet, that silence becomes the space where truth finally starts coming to the surface. See, you can hide behind words. You can distract yourself with arguments, with explanations, with excuses, with temporary fixes. But you can't hide in silence. Silence reveals, silence exposes, silence tells the truth that the noise tried to cover. When you both stop talking, you get to see where the relationship truly stands without the filters, without the pressure, without the emotional traffic. It's raw and sometimes it's uncomfortable, but it's real. In that silence, the first thing that happens is reflection. Not the shallow kind where you replay the argument in your head to see who was right or wrong. I'm talking about real reflection, the kind that forces you to look at yourself. When people stop talking, their minds start working overtime. You replay moments, you revisit decisions, you rethink the things you said or didn't say. You start asking yourself, did I handle that right? Did I listen? Did I take something for granted? Did I allow something I shouldn't have? Did I ignore something I should have addressed? Silence becomes a mirror, and for the first time, you see your own contribution to the situation. Sometimes that realization can be heavy. Sometimes it can be humbling. Sometimes it can be shocking. And sometimes it can be exactly what you needed to understand the depth of the issue. The next thing that happens in silence is that emotions finally settle into their real position. When you're upset, angry, frustrated, or overwhelmed, your emotions tend to speak louder than your logic. That's why arguments get messy, because people aren't responding to each other, they're reacting to how they feel in the moment. But when things quiet down, when the heat fades, when you get space to breathe, your emotions start to sit down and organize themselves. You finally get clarity. You stop reacting and you start understanding. You stop defending and you start feeling. You stop pointing fingers and you start recognizing patterns. That emotional clarity is one of the most important things silence gives you. You can't get that while talking over each other. You can't get that during arguments. You can't get that while trying to win instead of trying to understand. Silence gives both people the room to see their emotions for what they truly are. Another thing that happens in that silence is realization of value. People don't always understand what they have when they have it. Comfort can make someone careless. Familiarity can make someone blind. When communication stops, that's when people start noticing the little things they took for granted. They recognize the absence of good morning messages, the absence of check-ins, the absence of laughing together, the absence of comfort, the absence of connection. Silence makes people appreciate what their pride made them ignore. A lot of people don't realize what someone means to them until that silence feels a little too quiet, a little too long, a little too empty. Silence has a way of showing you the weight of someone's presence by fully introducing you to the weight of their absence. Silence also exposes intention, purely, cleanly, and undeniably. When both people go quiet, you discover who wants to fix things and who's comfortable letting things fade, because silence will force a choice. Either someone steps forward or they silently step out. Someone reaches out or someone stays distant. Someone values the relationship enough to break the silence, or someone is relieved to stay in it. Intentions become visible without a single word spoken. That's the beautiful and scary part of silence. It tells the truth. No explanations needed. If they care, you'll feel it. If they don't, you'll feel that too. Silence will show you whether the bond was real, or if it was held together only by words without action. But the most surprising thing silence does is give people the opportunity to grow individually. Sometimes the relationship can't move forward because one or both people are stuck in habits, fears, immaturity, or emotional patterns that they haven't dealt with. Silence becomes the space where growth starts to happen. You start asking deeper questions. You start confronting parts of yourself that you've been avoiding. You start realizing the areas where you need to level up communication, patience, understanding, respect, boundaries, emotional control. Silence is not just a pause in the relationship, it's preparation. A person can leave silence stronger, wiser, clearer, and more capable of loving right. Or they can leave it unchanged, unbothered, and uninterested in growth. Silence will expose that too. The truth is, when both people go silent, the universe steps back and watches what happens next. It becomes a turning point. Either silence destroys the connection because the foundation was already weak, or silence strengthens the connection because the bond was real and just needed space to breathe. Silence itself doesn't end relationships. Silence simply reveals the truth about them. And once that truth comes out, there's no going back to pretending. That's the power of silence. It doesn't lie, it doesn't sugarcoat, it doesn't hide. It shows you exactly where you stand and what needs to happen next.